enough of a social distance, you'll hear me better this way. So good evening, everyone. Welcome especially to the freshmen to your first day of in-person classes, which is fantastic. Welcome to President Garvey. Thank you for joining us. Today is a special day in so many ways. September 8th, the feast of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. So we chose Mary's birthday for your first day in class, which I thought was appropriate. I got some really terrific information this morning from our graduating class. You may remember during orientation, I told you that as of orientation day, we had 91% of our graduating students had jobs or were in grad school. As of this morning, it's 94%, which is still equal to last year. Last year in the booming economy, and we've matched that number this year. So that's just testimony to the quality of the education that you're getting. We're really, really proud of that. So. And now I would like to welcome Ambassador Lighthizer. Delighted to have you. I'm going to give you a bit of background on the ambassador, and then he's going to give us some sort of general comments, and then open up to questions. So I have some questions, you have some questions. Those of you following on Zoom will have some questions, and you know to email them to Dean Wrench, those of our students. So Ambassador Lighthizer is the 18th United States Trade Representative. Prior to this appointment, he was a partner at the law firm of Skadden, Arps, Slate, Maher, and Flom, where he practiced international trade for over 30 years. And in that work, was working on behalf of American workers and businesses, opening up markets to U.S. exports, and defending U.S. industries from unfair trade practices. He was lead counsel for numerous trade enforcement cases. It was well-known advocate for the type of America First trade policies that are promoted by President Trump. Before joining Skadden, Ambassador Lighthizer served as a deputy U.S. trade representative under President Ronald Reagan. And during that tenure, he negotiated over 24 bilateral international agreements, including on steel, on automobiles, and on agricultural products. He also served as vice chairman of the board of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. And then prior to that, he was chief of staff of the United States Senate Committee on Finance for Chairman Bob Dole. And in that position was a key player in enacting the Economic Recovery Act of 1981, the most significant tax reform in decades, as well as other basic elements of the Reagan economic program. Please give a warm Bush School welcome to Ambassador Lighthizer.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's an honor to be here with President Garvey, who you may not know, but my chief of staff is related to him. He's his smartest child, as near as I can tell. And it's a pleasure to be back at Catholic University. I always enjoy it when I come over here. Usually, to be honest, it's to go to Mass. So it's always a pleasant experience. I thought what I would do is give you just some kind of a general idea of a premise on international trade, then talk a little bit about the history of it, give you sort of like a 2-minute version of the history of the policy side of it. Is that?
Sorry, I was just getting a word from outside.
Oh, well, good. I can speak as loud. So first of all, I would say President Trump's approach, which is the same as mine, a different approach than others have had, than what you would think to be sort of the mainstream policy view of the international trade area. Our view is one that puts the workers and farmers first and has that as our objective. The more recent view, recent being the last 30 or 40 years, would be the purpose of international trade policy is to promote efficiency in business, make markets work better. And our kind of theory is that while that is an objective, it shouldn't be the primary objective. The primary objective should be the kind of community that you want, and then you decide what kind of people live in that kind of a community, and then you try to create jobs in an environment where that kind of a community is constructed. So it's a different view that people have had in the past. Our view is that the previous view, and I don't want to say the old view because there are a lot of old views that I'll go through in a second. The previous view really decided here's how we can make big businesses, or if you want, consumers get the most stuff the cheapest. And then at the end of the day, they kind of displaced people who were manufacturing job people and now don't have jobs. Those people will figure out a way to transfer money into their pockets so that they are productive, or at least not dissatisfied members of society. So anyway, that's the basic premise. One is what you'd call free trade, and what ours is a more America first, although if you're another country, it would be that country first, but a more worker and farmer oriented approach to trade policy. So let's talk for a second. I'll just give you the sort of history of the world if you think about trade policy, at least the history of the United States. So trade policy, first of all, if you go back to the beginning of the United States, there was not a lot of trade, as you can imagine. Then we had trade with Great Britain, which we had a fair amount of, and that was really dictated by their terms. And then when we became an independent nation, we had tariffs and excise taxes, basically, and that's how we funded our government. And then over a period of time, people would use tariffs not just to fund the government, but also to protect some industries or to help promote industries. And there was a debate back and forth in the body politics, and it would be between people that thought that was a good idea and people who thought they weren't. And you can go back all the way to Hamilton and Jefferson and that kind of, you have like in those days, you have like the kind of farmer community would be kind of against, but for lower tariffs, not really against it, for lower tariffs. Manufacturing people would be for higher tariffs. And the political parties would go back and forth, and it depended on kind of who was in. They were all reasonably high, but they would go up or down depending on the objective. And something really called the American system developed, and that is basically we developed manufacturing in the United States, largely assisted by tariffs. Great Britain had really done the same thing a generation before. By 1843, Great Britain had decided they were the manufacturing power of the world, and they decided that they wanted to go down the direction of free trade, and the United States did not do that, and we then became a great manufacturing power. I might say Germany also followed that same model. And we would have periods of time politically when people would say, let's lower tariffs, and when they would raise it. We can talk about the various periods when that happened. We had then the Great Depression, which most of you are aware of, and there's, I would consider sort of an urban myth that somehow tariff increases contributed to the creation or the duration of that, or the intensity of the Depression. And you'll think about that as you go on in your education and get older and think about these issues more. But the point I want to get to is we find ourselves then at World War, well, first we talked a little bit about World War I. There was a lot of trade around the world. That didn't stop people from going to war. The United States came in late, but got kind of a boost from that war in terms of its own economy. You kind of fast forward through a variety of different economic changes, and you find yourself at the most important point, which is World War II. So at the end of World War II, the United States is by far the richest country in the world. It's the biggest manufacturing country in the world. It's facing a world that had been destroyed. Either our enemies and our friends, they all had economies that were destroyed. And we also were looking at a threat from the Soviet Union as kind of a counterpole to the United States. So at that time, it was decided, I think, universally in public policy that we would lower tariffs and do the kinds of things necessary to encourage others to grow, right? So that Europe would have jobs, and ultimately Japan and other countries could grow. And they did, and their economies went on. And to some extent, we benefited to it, but from a lot we lost economically. And that continued over a period of time, and it was a smart and the correct bargain. We can talk about subsets of this if you like, but I just want to give you an overview of it. So then at the end of the war, you sort of start three things. You start the monetary policy of the world, which was something that was put together in New Hampshire at Bretton Woods in a big conference. You started the World Bank and the IMF, and that's one thing. And then you started the UN, was very negotiated at Dumbarton Oaks at Georgetown, and then basically signed in San Francisco. And then the third thing was, what are you going to do about trade? And they negotiated something called the International Trade Organization, or the ITO, but it was more controversial than the others, and it was never really approved by the United States, and because we didn't, nobody else did. And then you had something, kind of an underlying document called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is basically just a structure that we would all have tariffs, and we would kind of keep them all the same. And that really became the architecture for the whole economics of the world, but particularly in trade. It was this scattered General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. So this went on for a long time. The United States was doing the right thing. It was helping the world get richer. Eventually, we believe it got to the point where it was too expensive for us and no particular reason to keep doing it. And so you needed some kind of a change. And in our opinion, we needed a restructuring. Now, kind of a reset on what our trade objectives should be. The free trade people would say, let's keep going the way we were. We would say, no, let's have a more worker-oriented policy. So we have challenged some of the orthodoxy in the interest of putting America first. If you look at sort of why do I think this process that went on from basically 1947 until 2016, that's an exaggeration because there are ups and downs in it, but why do I think it failed? One, in the recent period, at the end of that, we had lost some 5 million manufacturing jobs. We had lost some 60,000 factories. We'd had enormous deficits. I mean, hundreds of billions of dollars. We'd lost jobs to China because they came into this system. We'd lost jobs to Mexico as a result of NAFTA. And you started to see a tendency in the United States, I would suggest, for sort of rich people to get richer and the lower middle class to get poorer. And it wasn't the kind of community that we want, not the kind of country we want. So we challenged the orthodoxy and say the United States is not going to continue to be the people that are kind of putting the bill for this development. Now I'm simplifying this, and I can talk about subsets as I say as we go on, but just to give you an overview. Yeah, that's where we are. What the president did is, one, he renegotiated NAFTA and became the USMCA. That's the agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So we renegotiated that. That was a huge agreement that had been entered into in the mid-1990s in the Clinton administration, and it was thought to be a great boon to the United States. It turned out to be good for some, but not good for a lot of people. The other big thing that's kind of worth talking about in terms of moving jobs around and having an effect on this process was that in the year 2000, China joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization. They became part of that. And up until that time, it was difficult to move a factory to China because every year you could have a vote in the United States Congress, which would put tariffs on them. So no one did it. At that point, that became permanent, and so you saw this huge growth in China. So those are kind of the big steps that went along. The president ran for election against that whole notion about where we were. Thought it wasn't fair to America, and particularly manufacturing workers, lower service workers. His philosophy, my philosophy, is that most Americans in the workforce do not have a college education, right? Most of them do not have a college education. The last numbers I saw was maybe 40%. Literally, it's that in that age group, that small, 40-45%. And those people that are not in that group are not going to be able to do a lot of things that you all are going to be able to do in your careers. But yet they have to have jobs that keep them in the middle class where they can raise their families and have a productive life. So what we did, one, we renegotiated that agreement. We renegotiated an agreement with Korea. We renegotiated an agreement with Japan. We put tariffs on a whole variety of things from China and sort of challenged China. Up till then, the kind of view was China is getting richer and challenging the United States was a good thing for both of us. That's not our view. Our view was it was better for them than it was for us. So we put tariffs on a lot of stuff there, ended up doing an agreement with them, which I can go into. This a little bit complicated. So that's just a history in a blink of an eye, and I'm happy to talk about the subsets. I realize that you all were just starting off in your career, and so a lot of these are ideas you probably haven't thought very much about. My hope is that you do start thinking about them, and that it becomes part of how you analyze public policy, and ultimately for some of you what you want to do. I guess I'd make one other distinction. There's a distinction between international trade policy, which is what I'm talking about, and being a business person in international trade, right? I mean, they're related, one affects the other, but they can be different career paths, and some people can go back and forth between the two, and if you can, that's one rich way to design a career for yourself. So maybe I'll pause there and let all that sink in. None of it will be on the exam. You don't have to worry about any of that. And I'm sure all of you worry about exams, or you wouldn't be at a Catholic university. So.
Thank you, Excellency. But let me start with something that will be on the exam. It just so happens, I think, that the freshmen in the room are right now studying theory of comparative advantage. So maybe it's a good place to begin. So academics, we write theory, we study theory. You're right there negotiating the actual agreements. What are some of the practical nuances, or maybe not so nuances, that academics might miss when we look at the pure theory versus what's happening in reality?
Well, let's say, first of all, David Ricardo is this is something we think about a lot. We think about the philosophy and the kinds of things you're teaching. I don't know that people who go into business do as much as we do, because we're sort of policy people and we analyze that. So, you're all studying. The basic notion is that you have sort of two islands, and I kind of make shoes and you make coats, and we switch and we both have more shoes and more coats. And notionally, that's the right answer, I think. Then you have a country as big as the United States where we can have shoes and coats, right? We can make them both here. And we can be in a position where we give somebody in Pennsylvania money for the steel, and he gives us the steel. And then in that case, we have both the steel and the money. So that's kind of like an anti-trade side of it. The notion of comparative advantage is important, but it only goes so far. The other thing when people talk about that I always think about are, so what is a comparative advantage? Or you'd say, well, a comparative advantage would be that you're stronger and I'm smarter, or I'm quicker, or we have natural resources and you don't have that one, but you have another one, and all these kinds of things. Is a comparative advantage the fact that in my country I can pollute, right? So I can make something, and instead of recycling and saving it and worrying about the planet, I dump it in the ocean, right? I mean, of course it is economically, but I would say it's nonetheless not what we're looking for, right? So you could say the ultimate comparative advantage probably would be to have slave labor, right? Because then you can really make stuff cheaply, and no one would espouse that. So when you think about comparative advantage, when you put it in the context that I'm in, that is to say a context of policy context, I want to take advantage of comparative advantage. But on the other hand, I don't think everything that gives economic benefit is actually a legitimate comparative advantage in the way that I think about it.
Thank you. So I want to pause if there are, we have a question, okay? We have a few questions coming in from students. So this is a question from a student. Could you take us inside one of the many moments you have spent with foreign leaders negotiating international trade agreements? Have any of those moments become intense, argumentative, or do they stay cordial? What's it like around the negotiating table?
That's interesting. So that's like a real world thing. I guess I would say all of the above. As a general matter, everybody develops their own kind of negotiating personality, right? And I try to start from the proposition that I know more about it than the people with whom I'm negotiating. And in all modesty, generally that's true, because most of them are at my level are politicians who really don't know the area that well. So they know more or less what they've learned or what they've been taught, and they haven't done it for a long period of time. You're always better off being cordial, right? You're always better off having a friendly. There are times when somebody will do or say something that sparks some level of outrage, particularly among redheaded people, one of which I was at one time. So we get outraged from time to time. So it's not without its moments. But for the most part, you try to be careful. You try to know the stuff better. You really want to have people realize that what you think is the right thing is in their interest too, right? There's a notion, some people say that, well, you can kind of charm people, and at the fringes, maybe you can do that. But for the most part, sensible, smart people with whom you're negotiating at the level we're doing it are going to know what's in their own interest, and you have to try to explain to them that this is really in their interest. And it's easier to do that if you're cordial. It's easier to do it if you know the basic facts, their situation as well as your own. And one technique that I use from time to time is I will be negotiating with a counterpart, a minister in another country, and I'll basically begin to cross-examine his expert, right? He's got his expert. He's got someone who he's brought with him who really knows this stuff, and I'll sort of just start asking that guy questions to draw out the fact that what their position really is not as sensible as they might otherwise think it to be. But I'm trying to think what else the flavor of the question would interest the asker. There's levels of formality in the negotiations. Sometimes you're sitting across a conference table for hours at a time. Sometimes you're in your own office having private conversations. There are times when parts of the negotiation, not necessarily the real nitty-gritty of it, but parts of it, you're in, for example, the cabinet room, and the president is there, and the president of the other country, or the prime minister, is there, and they've got their ministers, or you've got your ministers, and they'll say something that is really, in your opinion, not consistent with our policy or what the facts are, and you'll wait until the president will say, Bob, what's your response to that? And then you'll actually have that kind of you can see how that would be a very different kind of an environment. But mostly you're sitting at a conference table, and you've got your experts, you've got your brief, you've got a lot of hard work that you did, reading a lot of very detailed policy stuff. And you sit there and try to talk about the wording of what it'll be and how you get to a conclusion that's going to accomplish your objectives and still be in the interest of the other person.
Thank you. This is a related question from another student. What do you like best about the process of negotiating?
I guess ending it. I like best the signing ceremony, right? Because at that point you don't have to worry about it anymore. I don't know. What's interesting? I never really thought about that. There's redoing agreement that I think was, for example, in the case of USMCA, bad for American workers, and realize that you have something that's going to bring jobs back, for example, in the auto industry to the United States. That is something that gives you satisfaction, right? That makes you happy. But for the most part, it's just it's public service, right? You're kind of dedicated to the outcome. You're working very hard. We work very, very long hours, and when you're doing a negotiation, you're working very long hours for weeks on end. So, for the most part, it's hard work, and you have to accept it as kind of public service that you're doing good for your country.
This is another question from Nicholas. When aspiring to have a career in international relations or finances, do you think that it remains important to be able to speak multiple languages, or has it been made obsolete by the increase of the use of English and the improvements of translation technology?
So I've had people ask me what's the best way to become a good international trade lawyer or business person, and my initial thought, which isn't always well received, is learn how to write and think in English. Because if you can't do that, it doesn't make any difference, right? You've got to teach yourself how to work hard, how to think, and how to express yourself in English. All right, now, having said that, and if you don't have that, the rest of it doesn't matter. Having said that, then I think for sure learning languages is important. And it's important not just to help you communicate, but because it helps you learn how the other person thinks. And people, different countries, they do think differently than we do. And I'm not a linguist or an expert in this area, but I have read enough to be convinced that a key to how people think, how they analyze, process your arguments and their facts, a key to that is how they structure their own language. And we do it a certain way, the Chinese do it a different way, the Japanese do it a different way. Countries that are closest to us do it most similarly, of course. But I think there's a key to how people think in their language, and I certainly would encourage everyone to do that, assuming that you've learned to think in English, you're willing to work hard, and you're willing to write well in English, because if you can't do those things, then it's all a waste anyway, right?
Before you go, is there anybody in the room who wants to ask a question? I'll make sure we don't. If you do, just raise a hand. Yes.
So
Ambassador, just repeat the question, just
Yeah,
because it
please.
probably wouldn't. So, the question was, is the America First position a short-term or long-term answer to unemployment issues? Is that right? Yep.
So I would say, first of all, the issue is not just unemployment, right? It's more than unemployment. It's like good employment and good wages and the like. And there clearly there could be a response to a specific policy set, could have short-term as opposed to long-term or both. I think it's our objective, both in the short-term and the long-term. I think from our point of view, and I sort of take this as the one alternative is you can have, and I'll take the most absurd example, you can have a cheap t-shirt, $2 less t-shirt, and it's made in China. The other example would be you're going to pay $5 more for $3 more for the t-shirt or whatever, and it's going to be made in your own neighborhood, and this is the most extreme example, and you're going to have families around you that are relatively happy, right? Almost anyone here would make that trade. We say, yeah, it's not that important. We have enough. If you didn't have enough to eat, you'd have a different equation. But for me, I think most Americans will take the trade-off, and they really want the same objectives that we do. Now, some of them would look upon themselves merely as consumers, and they would say, no, it's actually better to be able to consume more, and therefore it doesn't matter where anything is made. Our kind of view is the contrary of that. But I think it's both a short-term and a long-term goal, and that is to say, family supporting kinds of jobs that people can make a contribution. The essence of it really is you feel good about yourself when you're getting reasonable pay for a productive job. You have a better feeling about yourself than you don't. And I think that's both a short-term and a long-term benefit. Now, any particular situation might favor one versus the other. But if you ask me what's my objective, obviously I want America to do well in the long term, but I think that's not inconsistent with it doing well in the short term.
So this is a three-part question. Part one, what is the most challenging aspect of negotiating with the Chinese government, and how do you handle that? Two, when tariffs were imposed on Chinese products, were you anticipating such a hostile response? And three, how do human rights considerations play into our trade policies with them?
So, let me start with the last one because it gives it's kind of a broader question. We have a very complicated relationship with China, right? Very complicated relationship with China, and they are at least an adversary, right? They are at least that. You draw the distinction, maybe they're worse or not, but they're at least an adversary. They have a different system than we do. They have different values. And their objective is to have China be number one in the world. That is their objective, and not the United States. And that relationship has a whole lot of lanes in it, right? There's the military, there's human rights, and our perception of how people should live. There's the economic one, or the trade one that I'm in. There's cybersecurity. There's various kinds of businesses, and you can divide them up almost any way you want. I try to stay in the trade lane. If I try to solve all the problems between the United States and China, then I'm basically not going to solve any of them. So I try to stay in my own lane. The human rights lane, I think, is an important aspect of that. It's not my aspect. There are times when it kind of intrudes on my aspect or becomes a legitimate thing for me to worry about, and I do. But for the most part, I try to stay in the economic sphere, because I think that way we can have some kind of a positive result, right? If you look right now and say the U.S. Discussions back and forth with China, probably, I don't want to say 100%, but a very high percentage of them are through the trade space, right? Because the rest of them are not going very well. So the trade space is where we have the most contact right now. I would say, I've enjoyed my conversation with the Chinese. The people that I deal with are very smart and genteel and well educated, have broad experience, some of it bad, like Cultural Revolution experience. So, or at least their fathers did. So I have a good group. I think I would have less positive feelings about personal interactions if I was dealing with some other people in some of the other lanes than I do with people I'm dealing with. They're smart, good people. When we talk, when we're not working, we talk about philosophy and Chinese history, which I find very fascinating. I've had good experiences with them. In terms of tariffs, yes, I think if I were going to express it, I would say, so if you go back to, let's do another sort of world span here in a minute. If you go back, before the 80s, you had Mao. If people are interested, I could take you through just like a flash. I'm not going to do it now, because everybody's saying, oh God, don't do it again. But of like Chinese history, it's important to really kind of understand Chinese history. But from our point of view, if you go back before the 80s, their economy is very small, they're withdrawn, they're screwing each other up all the different ways. Mao's doing all his things. We could go through all of that, and it's good. I really recommend that people study that. It's a really interesting and important thing to know. But and then we get like into the early 90s, and their economy started to take off a little bit. I'll just drop a footnote down. In 96, you'll recall there was giving, sort of illegal giving to the Clinton campaign. Maybe most of you don't remember that, it's too far long ago. But it was done by like China, and I wrote a New York Times article at that time, op-ed at that time, about how that money was intended really to influence the fact that China wanted to get into the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which they ended up doing. And sort of like the last thing that President Clinton did as president in his lame duck last year really was to put China in the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And they took advantage of those rules, and they grew from, I'm just going to notionally say, maybe a $2 trillion economy to a $13 trillion economy, right? In that period of time, to give you an idea in terms of the size of economies of the world, okay? I realize I'm dumping a lot of stuff on you that's probably beyond what you're interested in, but hopefully you'll become interested in it. The US has the biggest economy in the world by a lot, let's say $22 trillion. The next biggest is China. That's what they've done. And they're say at 13 or something. And then if you say who's under that, probably Japan or Germany 5 or 6. So, I mean, you're talking about real change over a short period of time. And a lot of that was done at the expense of the United States. So we would run $300-400 billion deficit every year with them. And a lot of what they did to improve their own situation was cleverly use those advantages. Some of them were economic, some of them were technology transfer issues and technology theft issues and a whole variety of other things that are not so good. But they really did use them and they really did grow. So no one really challenged what they did until President Trump came along. And then he challenged, I with him challenged him. And we started a study of forced technology transfer and intellectual property theft and all these kinds of things. And then took an action where we raised tariffs. And I think that's the idea behind the question. So were they happy with that? No, they were quite unhappy. They had really kind of had it their way. And they hadn't really been challenged, certainly not during the Obama administration, but also not during the W. Bush administration, and not during the Clinton administration, right? When they kind of got their foothold in. So it was a change in policy, a jarring one to them, and it's one that nonetheless, I think what we did was the right thing, and they weren't particularly pleased, but we do have an agreement. Hopefully it's a way to kind of move forward to develop international trade rules that are beneficial to us as well as to them. If you can hear that, you're going to have to.
Yep.
So you want to repeat
Yes,
something?
so the three parts, do the largest economies have a social responsibility? Correct me if second is, do tariffs support the social responsibility, and what has the Trump administration done in terms of to address the police brutality in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong protesters?
Do countries have a social responsibility? In my opinion, they do. It's not what I do, right? It's not my job. There are people who do that, who worry about that, and I certainly think people do. I think their first responsibility is to their own country, and if they fail that, then the rest of it probably doesn't matter that much. But I certainly think people have a social responsibility, not just with respect to human rights, which is the area that you're focusing on, but also with respect to the environment. I mean, there are a lot of other things where people have a social responsibility, in my judgment. And to the extent they infringe on our area, we are certainly cognizant of them. So if you look at, we don't have human rights elements in our trade agreements, but we certainly have environmental provisions in a lot of them. Certainly we do in the USMCA. Human rights more in my area, if there are, this is something that'll presumably you'll probably be reading about here in the next several days, and we've done it in the past, is that if there is evidence that products are made in China or somewhere else using forced labor, there's a law that we enforce, which law says you just can't bring the product into the United States. And that's something that, that's one way that we focus on that. In terms of the Uyghurs and Hong Kong, there are a lot of people who speak out on that issue and take actions against it. We've taken sanctions against China with respect to both of those. Once again, it's not my area, right? The Secretary of State does that, or the Secretary of Treasury and others. In terms of the relationship of tariffs, have we tariffed people for human rights violations? I would say the answer to that is probably no. We have, though, stopped the product from coming in, right? Because it's kind of hard to sort of say that's made with slave labor, so we're going to put a 10% tariff on it, right? So we think that sort of 10% is the right amount, right? I mean, you can see notionally how you'd say, no, that's so abhorrent. We're just not going to have the product in the United States at all. So it is a factor in that respect. I would say tariffs are more a tool, one, to fund the government, and they indeed were the principal way it was funded until the income tax came in, right, in the early part of the 20th century. But also they are aware to make sure that that people who you might think of who sell in the United States and get the benefit of this system pay some amount. That there's some tariff, some amount of money that you have to pay to actually have access to our market. And I think about it more as a domestic policy element, right? You have to be careful, like everything else. You have to be careful with how you use them. But I think they used properly help to create manufacturing jobs and the sorts of things that we want to accomplish in our economy. But once again, it's not like you can say that a 10% tariff is good and therefore a 50% tariff is 5 times better, right? Clearly, it's a more complicated equation than that. But I think they're an important policy tool. I don't think of them particularly in the human rights space. There are other tools for that. So I missed some of that.
So we're the biggest economy in the world, right?
Right.
Where domestically our states trade with states. So what's the best argument one can make for globalization?
What's the best argument one can make for globalization?
Yeah, if you're the United States, is there a point to it? Is that the question? Yeah.
So I would say, first of all, I'm not against globalization, but I'm certainly not in favor of it. I think it's more complicated than that. And for some people, globalization means basically you manufacture overseas and sell in the United States. And I think that's not in the interest of the United States. But I think certainly international trade is important. And if you kind of go back and think historically, you sort of think, why did, I think you're kind of, when you say globalization, it's kind of like the free trade idea is the what? I still couldn't hear that. Mask imports or mass imports? So we clearly wanted to get back to where we started and what Andrew brought up at the beginning. We want to take advantage to the extent it makes sense of actual comparative advantage. So I'm not, and the president's not against trade generally. I mean, we think trade is a sensible thing to do. It does make the country, it makes the United States richer. We're clearly interested in markets to export to. And that certainly makes the United States richer. It creates jobs. You just can't be, you can't have, I would say, massive, unsustainable, massive one-sided trade, huge trade deficits over a long period of time. People, and this is like another proxy for globalization, people talk about trade deficits generally, and economists would tell you, well, their bilateral trade deficits are irrelevant. And to the extent that's true, they would say overall trade deficits are irrelevant. That is global trade. I would say that's probably less true. And then usually what I say is, but we don't have that. What we have now is this massive shift of wealth from the United States to other people because we're over consuming. And you see trade deficits of 50 and 100, 200, 600, 800 billion dollars, right? At some point, that kind of importing without exporting is not a sustainable model and not something that's in the interest of the United States. But I mean, certainly if you think of globalization as the United States imports a part, puts it in something else, sells that overseas, that notion going back and forth, I think does make the United States wealthier, does create jobs, and is in fact healthy for us. Assuming you have a fair trade component of it. In other words, assuming that you're not dealing with another government that has as its policy to subsidize something that puts your people out of business, or if people aren't using closed markets or something else to take an unfair advantage. You know, in a case where that's absent, I think that manufacturing overseas or having supply lines that are not entirely in the United States can be beneficial. But I'm not a globalist. I'm kind of an if you ask globalists, they'd say I'm an anti-globalist. Say what?
Are you protectionist?
Well, you see, that's interesting. What actually does that mean? That's why kind of when I started out, I sort of said and gave you kind of the history. The idea of a protectionist really, originally the idea was that you have a certain tariff, whatever that is, and that's the tariff you need to kind of support your government. And then if you want to add tariffs on top to take care of a specific industry, then that would be a protectionist tariff. That was kind of the debate, right? And people would come in and say, no, we want tariffs, but not protectionist tariffs with respect to specific. And there were abuses in that, right? Because people would use political power and this and that to defend various industries, some of which deserved defending and some of which didn't. But if you asked, I mean, this is the term has become sort of pejorative now. If you asked, say, every Republican president from Abraham Lincoln until probably up to Eisenhower, are you a protectionist? They would say, yes, I'm a protectionist, right? In other words, they ran for election in part. There were a lot of other things going on, wars and all kinds of things, but they ran in part on this American system that I mentioned before, the American system. They ran saying we're going to develop jobs and good work for American people, middle-class people, right? And we're going to do it using one of the tools, be tariffs, right? So, you know, was that a protectionist? I don't know. You know, I'm certainly not a free trader. And so if the opposite of a free trader is protection, I'm a protectionist. But for me, it's like more complicated than that. But no one would accuse me of being a free trader. That I can guarantee you. But I have been accused of being a protectionist.
The question in the back.
I'm going to have you tell me the answer. I mean, the question first, and then you can tell me the answer too if you want. But I got to start with the question.
So can you repeat it? You could just dip the mask just while you. So the ethical standpoint of trade policy when the US is trading with a much smaller country.
Yeah, well, see, first of all, we're always trading with smaller countries, right? But some of them are weak, poor countries. You know, I don't think about it. I guess when you say ethics, I would say fair, right? You want to kind of have a fair situation. When I negotiate, I'm trying to get a deal that favors us. The margin is fairly small when you're dealing with poor countries, right? And generally, those countries benefit more than we do from our having a trade agreement with them, or from their being able to be in the WTO. A lot of the notion of free trade really helps countries that are relatively powerless because it has like one set of rules for everyone, and everyone gets the same, notionally the same vote. You know, I don't think of it, my lane, the actual trade lane, as being one where we have particular ethical issues, right? I mean, I'm trying to get fair trade for American workers. The person I'm negotiating with is doing the same thing. If you're thinking about back in like the colonial days when people would go in and maybe build a plantation in South America and basically take advantage of the population, I think there's probably some of that goes on in the world, but I think it's probably less of it, and probably less by the United States than other countries. But that's not specifically something that I would worry about in my current job. if there was some kind of a challenge, some violation of rules, then there's a method that people can bring those actions, and they do, from time to time. But I mean, my basic objective is to help America. I figure the woman or guy on the other side's got the same objective for their country, and I have an advantage in that I'm offering access to the biggest market in the world, and not only the biggest, by far the freest, right? By far the less restricted by tariffs or non-tariff barriers or other kinds of built-in disadvantages, because we're like this one great big market, and if you can get in, you can move around and make money. It's one of the reasons why we have a trade deficit, probably is that.
How have your Catholic values impacted your professional life, and what has been one of the most challenging moments of your professional life?
So, what are my Catholic values? Well, I hire a bunch of Catholics, but I hire non-Catholics too. I don't want that guy. I hire Catholics, I hire non-Catholics. I don't know. I guess, my father was a doctor, but he was like the first person in his family that had ever gone to college, and we came over a long time ago. Lighthizer have been in the United States for years and years and years, and for whatever reason, we're basically in the steel industry. When I say in the steel industry, I mean like in the steel mills, shoveling and doing that sort of stuff, and did from making pig iron and then ultimately steel for generation after generation. My father did it also before he went to college and then medical school. I think we all get our basic values from where we're from, and for me, it's a small industrial town that didn't do so well in this world of globalization, and I would say probably unfairly. And then I think we get it from the church, right? And I'm informed, and molded by the church like anyone else. I don't get it particularly from Catholic social teaching. I mean, I never, I went to Catholic schools, right? I went to Catholic only grade school, high school, college, and law school. But other than that, I didn't go to any. But I know I didn't really, study that side. But for me, it was a religion. It was theology. It was about, personal growth and trying to do what's right in my own personal life. Now, there are a lot of people who spend a lot of time in the Catholic Church worrying about some of these other issues, and I guess I didn't disregard them, but I was probably more molded by the fact that I was from a small industrial town, and that was, what I cared about. But it may be that I'm wrong, and that I was influenced by priests and brothers who had this objective. And then what was my biggest something or another? Well, I mean, I guess if it was obvious, I would blurt it out. But my professional life goes on for so long, right? I have to go back through all the years. I don't know. I don't remember a moment where I was particularly down and out. I mean, it's just like a matter of personality, just keep kind of chugging along and doing it. I guess if you said, what was your biggest challenge, the other side, the way to analyze that would be like, what is your biggest achievement? And then that flipped over would be your biggest challenge. And I don't know, I guess I would say either the China agreement, which we negotiated, or the several year process of renegotiating NAFTA and creating this U.S., Mexico, Canada agreement. And then negotiating what is really a very good agreement for the United States that will bring hundreds of thousands of jobs back, getting the other side to agree to it, but also then getting it through the political process and doing it in a way when everyone said it was basically impossible, and ending up with 90% of the Congress voting for it, right? Overwhelming majority of Republicans and Democrats voting for the agreement. Sort of a, in a very kind of a toxic Washington world where nobody gets along on anything. We got that passed. It took a while. I mean, we negotiated it for a couple of years and then spent a year working with Congress. But in the final analysis, we got something that Republicans and Democrats both stood up and said was a vast improvement and something that's really, really important for America. And obviously the president was the most important person, but the speaker was important, right? And Senator Wyden, who's the Oregon senator, who's the ranking Democrat on the Finance Committee, the Committee of Jurisdiction, he was extremely important. And there's just a variety of important people on the right and on the left, Republicans and Democrats, who made a substantial contribution. So I guess if one of those two things, I'm happiest about. But there are a lot of other kind of things you can hit on too. I did an agreement with the Soviet Union, so I'll spend a moment on this. Now this time I'm like 36 years old, so I was I'm both the oldest U.S. trade representative and the youngest deputy U.S. trade representative in history. One of my friends told me that it took me 35 years to get a promotion, which is a reasonable way to think about it. But none of you will remember this, except for President Garvey, and that even includes you, probably won't. But in 1979 and 80, the Russians invaded Afghanistan, and Jimmy Carter, in his wisdom, cut off grain sales to the Soviet Union in those days. Remember, in those days, the big competition for decades was the Soviet Union and the United States, and he cut this off. And he lost the election in part because of it to Ronald Reagan, not just because of it, but it was a contributing factor. And then in 83, President Reagan decided we would negotiate a new trade agreement with the Soviet Union, and I did that agreement in 1983. So that was a long time ago. I haven't thought about it in a long time. I only think about it when I want to brag. The rest of the time, I forget about it entirely. But that was another one that was a good, interesting, historic agreement.
So we have two questions here.
So I know maybe there might be some subtlety, but it's basically free trade, globalization are basically market capitalism.
Right. An extension of capitalism, and if America is a capitalist country, shouldn't we then be in favor of free trade? Is that, yep?
Yeah, so there certainly are people who make that argument, and I usually would come back to, in that context, what is free trade, right? Is free trade letting other people get an advantage over you? There are people who certainly would say that, right? I would say that number one, pure free trade really is a way to maximize your citizens as consumers, right? And so I think I'm against it. I'm not against it, but I'm against an extreme version of it because I think it loses sight of what I tried to say at the beginning. That is to say, we're really more than consumers, right? We are more than consumers. We're also producers, and you have to be able to produce. But I certainly see benefits from trade. The other thing I would say is when we say free trade, it's kind of a test tube thing, right? Because there really isn't. There are very few examples of real free trade, because people have tariffs, which you've talked about and we've all talked about. There are other kinds of barriers to entry. There are standards. There are the fact that some countries just don't buy from other people because they have their own personal prejudices. But there are tax systems that throw the system off, right? There's a lot of, it's very complicated. It really isn't just a situation where you have pure market capitalism. it's mixed up in everybody's social policy. So I would say free trade, real pure free trade, doesn't probably exist anywhere. If you said as a kind of a test tube thesis, is it a good thing? Yeah, I would say it's probably a good thing, assuming, and then we always say assuming that it's fair, which means that we don't think that it is fair, right? So what a large part of what we do, and if you look at these agreements, is break down barriers, other people's barriers to U.S. access, so that we can sell more overseas. But this notion of pure free trade, pure protectionism is all a continuum. There is no real, there's no pure example. There may be some pure examples of one of protectionism, but there's really none of a pure free trade to me. So to me, it's a kind of a more complicated analysis. And what I'm trying to do is figure out a way to you can say level the playing field, but help my objective, my team. So theoretically, I wouldn't argue if you were sitting down with an economist, and I've had these arguments, you can imagine, for decades with economists who would say that's the objective. I would say, well, the problem is that it doesn't really exist anywhere. Everybody's trying to get an angle. Everyone's, tilting the playing field if they can. And our objective is to kind of tear down barriers and make it freer. And I think if we do that, then we're better off as a country. And then when you have this analysis, the other thing you have to think about is there is this other system that we have to think about too, right? Which is the non-market economy system, which is also in competition with us. And we can't be in a position where we basically let them, which we've done a lot in the last decades, basically get the advantage on us because we have this kind of not quite unilateral disarmament, but sort of open up our market in a way that they can't. And I guess the last thing I'd say on this, while in a test tube, free trade works out the best, in reality, if you look at who has done the best, it tend to have been people, at least in the manufacturing area, who had the benefit of tariffs. If you kind of go through the big industrial empires that have built up, it tend to be with some advantage in tariffs. So it kind of, it's a little bit, experience is slightly different than the model. But, if I had to, I guess I could argue the other side. I would just be wrong. But I could argue the other side of it too.
Question over there.
You're going to have to give me that. Oh, good.
From a trade perspective, does what a country or a territory, in this case, Puerto Rico, have to offer? Is that significant for statehood? Is that so its ability in terms of what it can sell to the world or into the United States, into the rest of the United States?
Well, it certainly wasn't. It certainly wasn't. If you go through the history of the United States, I don't think we added states for that reason. If you're Puerto Rican and your view is that what's the relationship between statehood and Puerto Rico, I mean, that's like a question that's kind of out of my field. As a general matter, we have done some things to try to create, as a matter of policy, create employment in Puerto Rico. The United States has done a variety of things, right? And Puerto Rico has access in the United States that any state really does. I mean, it has the advantage really of having total access to our market, and for the most part, not having to pay the taxes to support it. So I don't particularly have an opinion on statehood for Puerto Rico, but it certainly would not be influenced by whether Puerto Rico would be good or bad for the United States as a trading component, right? To me, it's more of it's a different kind of it's a political question for people to make.
Will the U.S. try to limit China's influence in trade with Latin America? And if so, how would it go about doing so?
Well, I don't know about limit their influence. To the extent there's a competition, we have to worry about their model, right? And we want our model, which you would call the capitalist model, however you want to define the edges of it, is substantially different than theirs. And it's not in our interest if they have an exaggerated influence in Latin America, right? And my own view would be it's not in Latin America's interest either. And usually what that exaggerated influence means is taking natural resources out, in many cases creating debt. There has been an attempt by China to move in that area, as well as in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a variety of sort of areas where they've been active, but I mean, I think we have to just insist on our system, which is this, we call it this modified capitalist system, as opposed to a non-market economy system. Ours is like a market system. We have to there's going to be a competition between these two systems, and the competition goes beyond economics, right? It goes to personal freedom and how you structure your lives and all those sorts of things. And it's important, in my opinion, for the United States to win that competition, and I think we will in the long run. I think in the long run, the benefits of freedom expressed in free markets, but in other ways also will outweigh their method, and that will prevail. Goodness gracious. Best piece of advice. Or no, don't go out with that girl, probably. But I was very young, so I didn't do it. But who knows? Maybe it was bad advice. No, I'm being facetious. Obviously, I don't know. I try to give you my idea. If you said what makes people have a successful career, is finding something you like. President Garvey has thought about this, and Andrew has thought about it 15 times more than I have. I have to give advice like that to 2 children and now 3 grandchildren, right? So, but to me, it's you got to find something you like to do. You'll do well. If you work hard at it, right? Be sort of true to your basic principles. But I don't know. I'll give that some more thought if I come up with a really good answer. One thing it won't be would be go to a damn Duke basketball game. The greatest Duke game was Georgetown beating them. So, and my own personal view is there's 2 kinds of people: there are people that went to Duke and people that root against them. That would be the piece of advice that I got. Don't root for Duke. No, I'm kidding.
So an example of a tariff that was created to protect some segment of our market, but turned out to be harmful.
You see, you'd have to go back pretty far because we've had really small tariffs for the most part for years. I don't know. Nothing really comes to mind. Something that would make something more expensive that we actually needed. I mean, if you wanted the classic example that people who study this forever would give you, would be that, and I mentioned before that in 43 or whatever, Great Britain, which had been the greatest power of the world, world had their first sort of free trade debate, and free trade won, and they were like the biggest in the world. The benchmark for that was repealing what were called the Corn Laws, right? And so the Corn Laws were laws that they had that basically put tariffs and made it very expensive to import food into Great Britain, and it was just devastating for working people, and it was devastating for all but wealthy farmers, right? And the debate was really about repealing the Corn Laws, and they did mercifully repeat it, right? And the Corn Laws were undoubtedly had a very negative effect for a long time on Great Britain. So I don't know that there are probably examples that I'm not thinking of that the United States has had some kind of similar kind of tariff. That would be the classic example of a tariff or a trade policy that was clearly had a negative effect on society, helped a handful of people, and made it difficult for everyone else to eat. So I guess I'd say repealing the Corn Laws is probably an example of that.
Thank you so very much for spending time with us. There's a round of applause for the ambassador.
Good luck. Good luck. I hope you enjoy your college education. This is, as I'm sure your folks have told you, a great time in your life. So work hard and have fun.